Why, hello there, Econ students. This is Professor Perrott explaining supply and demand. Now, the concept of supply and demand is the most important concept in all of economics, and consequently, this is the most important chapter in all of the book. In fact, the later chapters are mostly just extensions of the model that we're going to learn in this chapter. So it's important that you understand it thoroughly. Our goal is to understand market behavior. A market is a group of buyers and sellers of a particular product. So when we say the word market, we don't mean a particular market in a particular place. We don't mean the fish or bread market downtown. Rather, we just mean that the forces of supply and demand are coming together to determine the price of the product and the quantity bought and sold. For now, we're going to assume a competitive market. A competitive market is just a market with many buyers and sellers such that each has a negligible effect on the price. So we're not assuming a monopoly. Okay, so we're going to do this in steps. We're going to look at the demand curve first, then the supply curve, and we're going to put them together and show how demand and supply come together to determine the price and quantity of everything produced in a market economy. Remember, in a market economy, there's no central planner determining what gets made and who gets to purchase it. Rather, there's just millions of individuals all acting on their own, and that's the sort of thing that we're trying to capture in this model. We're just trying to show how the spontaneous decisions of millions of individuals come together to determine an outcome that is not random. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about a demand curve is that it's downward sloping. That's what I mean by the law of demand. It's a claim that the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of the good rises, other things being equal. By quantity demanded, we just mean the quantity of the good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. So there's an inverse relationship between the price of a product and the quantity that people buy. So if the price goes up, quantity demanded falls. If the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. Now, this is the most important lesson of all of economics. Now, some of you are saying, wait a second, I thought you said the most important lesson in all of economics is that incentives matter. Well, actually, this is basically the same thing. We're just applying the idea of incentives matter to a market context. Remember, incentives matter just means that if the costs of something go up, people will do less of it. If the cost goes down, people will do more of it. Well, for the consumer of a product, the cost is the price that you have to pay in order to purchase it. So we're just saying that consumers of products respond to incentives in predictable ways, just like people respond to incentives in predictable ways in other walks of life. A demand schedule is just a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. So, for example, here's my demand for lattes. Now, notice that my preferences obey the law of demand. Right? So all this is it's a schedule showing different hypothetical prices and the quantity of the good, in this case lattes, that I would buy at each of those hypothetical prices. So, for instance, if lattes had a zero monetary price, I'd probably buy about 16 a week. I wouldn't want to drink more than a couple a day, even if they were free. And right now, I would say the market price is about $3 where I live, and I tend to buy about 10 a week. And if the price went up to about $6, I still buy a couple, but not as many as I do right now. Right, so the higher the price, the fewer I would purchase given my income and my preferences and everything else. So here all we're doing when we build this demand schedule is we're holding everything constant except for the price. So we're saying, assuming I make the same amount of money, I have the same preferences, and the price of all the other goods in the economy are the same. Everything else is the same. Right, this table just shows you what happens if the price changes. So far we've just created my demand schedule for lattes, which is a table that shows how many lattes I would purchase at different hypothetical prices. If we graph the information contained in this table, then we'll get my demand curve for lattes. So how are we going to graph this? Well, there's two variables, price and quantity, and it's traditional to measure the price along the vertical axis and the quantity along the horizontal axis. So we have prices going from 0 on upwards along the vertical axis, and we're measuring quantities going from 0 on upward along the horizontal axis. And each one of these sets of prices and quantities is 1 point on my demand curve. So for instance, if the price were $0, I'd purchase 16 lattes. So the first point on my demand curve is the point $0 and 16 lattes. If the price were $1, I'd buy 14. If it were $2, I would buy 12. and so on. So each one of these sets of points is 1 point on my demand curve for lattes. Now, if we draw a line through all of these points, then we have my demand curve for lattes. The demand curve just shows how many lattes I would purchase at any hypothetical price. So, for instance, if the price of lattes were higher than it is now, if it were $6, let's say, then you start off at $6 along the vertical axis, you go over to the demand curve and down, and it shows you that the quantity I would purchase would be 4. Or if the price were $2, you start off at $2 along the vertical axis, you go over to the demand curve and down, and it shows that I would purchase 12. So this demand curve just shows how many lattes I'd buy at any hypothetical price. Notice that the demand curve is downward sloping. This reflects the first law of demand. The first law of demand just states that there's an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. The higher the price, the less the quantity demanded. So if the price is low, the quantity that I would purchase is higher than if the price were high. So far we found my individual demand curve for lattes. The way that you find the market demand for products is by adding together the demand of all the individuals in the market. So for instance, if we wanted to find the demand for lattes of all the individuals in the class, we'd add together the individual demands of everyone in the class. Or if we wanted to find the demand for lattes in the city, we'd add together the demand of all the individuals in the city, and so on. So just to show you how this works, let's just suppose now that there are 2 buyers in the latte market instead of 1. There's Nick and Michelle. And first, let me just reproduce my demand schedule. And next to it, I'm going to put Michelle's demand schedule. So Michelle, she likes lattes, but she doesn't like them as much as me. So right now the price is about $3, and she buys about 5 a week. So she buys about half as much as me. So her demand is less than mine. So she likes it, but not quite as much. Now the way that we would get the market demand for lattes is adding up the quantities of all the individuals in the market at each price. So right now there's just 2 individuals in the market, Nick and Michelle. And if the price were $0, I would purchase 6. Michelle would purchase 8, and so the total quantity demanded in the market would be 16 plus 8, or 24. If the price were $1, I'd purchase 14, and Michelle would purchase 7, so the total amount purchased in the market would be 21. If the price were $2, the total quantity demanded would be 18, and so on. Here I have on the right the quantity demanded in the total market, and on the left is the price. So if we graph that new sets of points of price and market quantity demanded, then we would get the market demand curve. So here I just reproduced those sets of points. It shows you at each price what quantity would be demanded in the market as a whole. And if we graph that sets of points, then we would get the market demand curve for lattes. Okay, we need to make a distinction between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. A change in the price of a good will cause a change in the quantity demanded in the market. So we just said, according to the law of demand, if the price goes up, the quantity demanded will fall, and if the price goes down, the quantity demanded will rise. So this change in quantity demanded is reflected by a movement along the demand curve. So for instance, the price of a latte where I live is currently $3, and the quantity demanded by Nick and Michelle is 15. If the price were to rise, that would cause a movement along the curve. Right? So if the price increased to $4, the quantity demanded would fall to 12. So the way that we show that shift in price is, where currently the price is $3 and the quantity demanded is 15, and we move along the same demand curve if there's a change in the price. If something other than the price changes that's related to demand, then we're going to have to shift the whole curve. Right? So by demand we mean the entire schedule. So a change in price causes a change in quantity demanded, meaning a movement along the same curve. A change in something else related to demand might shift the whole schedule. So the demand curve shows how price affects quantity demanded, everything else equal. Okay, well, what if these other things changes? Right, so other things are important to people's demand. So for instance, people's income, the price of other goods, and so on. If one of these other things changes, then we're going to have to shift the whole curve. So a change in price causes a change in quantity demanded, which is reflected by a movement along the same curve. A change in something else related to demand will shift the entire curve and cause a change in demand. So now we're going to go through 5 different important demand curve shifters. So these are 5 different things that can shift the entire demand curve. The first thing that could shift the whole demand curve is the number of buyers. Remember that the demand in the market is just found by adding up the quantity demanded by each individual at each hypothetical price. So if we add in a larger number of people in the market, then that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. So for instance, if we have our original market demand curve, if we add in another person who buys, say, 5 lattes, right, that'll increase the number of lattes bought by 5 at each hypothetical price. So an increase in the number of demanders or buyers would shift the whole curve to the right. And a decrease in the number of buyers would shift the whole curve to the left. Another thing that can shift the whole demand curve is the income of consumers in the economy. And here we have to make a distinction between normal goods and inferior goods. For normal goods, demand is positively related to income. So in other words, if people's income increases, they'll buy more of the good at each hypothetical price. So this is the normal situation. Normally, as your income goes up, you'll buy more of most things. So if my income went up, I would buy more nice cars, I would buy more meals in restaurants, and so on. For an inferior good, it's the opposite. So these are things where if your income went up, you would buy less of them. So these are things like ramen noodles or other products where if your income went up, you'd purchase fewer of them. Right? So for a normal good, notice that if your income increases, your demand increases. For an inferior good, if your income increases, your demand decreases. And the next important demand curve shifter is the price of related goods. So here we have to make a distinction between substitutes and complements. 2 goods are substitutes if an increase in the price of one causes an increase in the demand for the other one. So substitutes are things that are good replacements for each other, things like butter and margarine and so on. So for a lot of people, they like pizza, they like hamburgers. If there's an increase in the price of pizza, there'll be an increase in the demand for hamburgers. So the price of pizza goes up, and a lot of people, they don't really care too much if they buy hamburgers or pizza. So if the price of one goes up, they'll just buy the other one. Or things like Pepsi and Coke are most people consider to be good substitutes for one another. If the price of Coke goes up, people will stop buying Coke, they'll start buying Pepsi. That'll increase the demand for Pepsi. Or butter and margarine is a good example. If the price of margarine goes down, people will buy a lot more margarine, they'll not buy as much butter. So that would cause the demand for butter to fall, and so on. So just notice that for substitutes, an increase in the price of one causes an increase in the demand for the other one. 2 goods are complements if an increase in the price of one causes a fall in demand for the other one. So complements are things that tend to go together, things like ketchup and fries and golf clubs and golf balls and so on, peanut butter and jelly. So, for example, right, if the price of computers went up, fewer people would buy computers and they would buy less software to go along with it. Right? So people tend to consume complements as a bundle. So if the price of one of the things in the bundle goes up, the price of doing the whole activity goes up. Right? So people probably do less of both. One other thing that could shift the demand curve is people's expectations. In particular, people's expectations about the future price of goods or their future income. So for instance, if people expect their incomes to rise, their demand for meals at expensive restaurants may increase now. Or conversely, if the economy sours and people worry about their future job security, the demand for new automobiles might fall today. Or to take another example, imagine that the price of gas were going to double tomorrow. And you knew that, or expected that. What would that do to your demand for gas today? Well, most of you would go up and fill up your gas tank today because you know the price is going to rise in the future. So expectations about future prices and your income in the future and the state of the market in general in the future are going to affect your purchasing decisions today. Okay, so to sum up what we've learned about the demand curve, a change in the price of a good will cause a movement along the same demand curve. a change in anything else related to demand will shift the entire curve. So if there's an increase in the number of buyers, that'll shift the demand curve to the right. If there's a decrease in the number of buyers, it'll shift the curve to the left. If there's an increase in your income, that'll shift your demand for normal products to the right. It'll shift your demand for inferior products to the left. If the price of related goods changes, it'll shift the demand curve. So for two goods that are substitutes, if the price of one good goes up, the demand for the other good goes up. And for complements, if the price of one good goes up, the demand for the other good goes down. Tastes can shift the demand curve. If people suddenly like certain products more, it'll increase the demand for those products, shifting their demand curves to the right. And changes in expectations can also shift the demand curve. Okay, now let's think about the supply curve. The supply curve just shows the behavior of sellers or producers in a market setting. And the law of supply states that the quantity of a good produced or supplied will go up when the price of the good goes up, other things being equal. So there's a positive relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. As the price of a product goes up, producers will produce and sell more of it. The price that a producer can get for their product goes down, they'll produce and supply less of it. So just like we had a demand schedule for lattes, we could also build a supply schedule. Supply schedule just shows the relationship between different hypothetical prices and the quantity of a good that suppliers will produce. So for example, Starbucks supply of lattes, and notice that the higher the price, the more that they would be willing to sell. And just as before, right, each one of these sets of prices and quantities constitutes a different point along the supply curve for the product. So if we graph out a set of all of these points along the supply schedule, then we get the supply curve. And notice that the supply curve is upward sloping, indicating the law of supply. So the higher the price that you can get for producing something, the more of it you'll produce. The market supply curve is found by adding up the quantity supplied in the market for all of the suppliers at each hypothetical price. So if there were more than one coffee shop, say Starbucks and Jitters, right, to find the total supply in the market, we'd have to add up the supply of lattes produced by Starbucks and the supply produced by Jitters at each hypothetical price. And that would give us the total market supply. So if we graph the set of different prices and quantity supplied in the market as a whole, we get the whole market supply curve. And just as before, a change in price would cause a change in quantity supplied, and we show that by moving along the same supply curve. Right, so the way that you read the supply curve is at any hypothetical price, you go over to the supply curve and down, and it shows you the quantity supplied at that hypothetical price. So for instance, for this particular market, if the price of lattes were $3, you go over to the supply curve and down, and it shows that 15 would be supplied. Or if the price were $6, you go over to the supply curve and down, and it shows you that 30 would be supplied. Now, if something other than price changes related to the cost of producing something, then that'll shift the whole supply curve. The supply curve is inversely related to the cost of production. So if the cost of producing something go up, the supply decreases. If the cost of producing something goes down, everything else equal, the supply will increase. So we're going to go through four important supply curve shifters. First, if the price of an input that goes into producing something goes up, that'll shift the supply curve. So for instance, if the wages that Starbucks has to pay their employees goes up, then that'll shift the supply curve to the left. Or if the price that they have to pay for coffee goes up, that'll decrease the supply, which you show by shifting the whole curve to the left. If, on the other hand, there was a great season and there was an abundance of coffee and the price of coffee fell, then the amount of lattes that Starbucks would supply would increase, right? The supply curve would shift to the right. Changes in technology can also shift the supply curve. So if there's some sort of technological development that makes it cheaper to produce a particular good, that'll increase the supply, and we'll have to shift the whole supply curve to the right. If the number of sellers in the market increases, that'll increase the supply. We'll show that by shifting the curve to the right. Or if the number of producers in the market declines, then we'll shift the curve to the left. So I think this is pretty straightforward. More producers, more supply. Less producers, less supply. If new companies enter the market, that'll increase the supply, shifting the curve to the right. If current producers leave the market, that'll decrease the supply, shifting the curve to the left. And finally, changes in expectations could change producer supply decisions. So for instance, let's say that people expected that a war was going to break out in the Middle East. Well, in response, producers of oil might cut back their supply today in order to sell in the future. So, the assumption here is that this war in the Middle East might disrupt the supply of gas coming from overseas in the future. So you tend to expect that the price of gas is going to go up in the future. And if you're selling something and the price is going to go up in the future, well, you want to hold on to some of it that you're making now while the price is lower, reserve it, and then in the future when the price rises, you can sell it at a higher price. Okay, so just like people's expectations can influence their purchasing decisions, producers' expectations can influence their supply decisions. So to quickly summarize, a change in price causes a movement along the supply curve. The higher the price, the greater the quantity supplied, everything else being equal. If there's a change to input prices, technology, the number of sellers or producers' expectations, then that's going to shift the entire curve. The supply and demand for a good come together to determine the price of the good and the quantity bought and sold. Remember, a market is decentralized. There's many different buyers and there's many different sellers, and none of these individuals alone determines the price of the good or the quantity bought and sold. Right? It's the interaction of all these people together that causes the price to emerge. The price of a good in a market economy will gravitate towards the equilibrium price. The equilibrium price is just the price where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. So in our example here, the equilibrium price would be $3. It's where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. So X marks the spot, and you'll see that at a price of $3, the quantity that consumers want to purchase is equal to the quantity that producers wish to make. Right? At any other price, there's either going to be frustrated buyers or frustrated sellers. The price gravitates towards the equilibrium price because that's the only price in which no one, neither suppliers or demanders, have an incentive to alter their behavior. If the price happened to be higher than the equilibrium price, then the quantity that people produce would be greater than the quantity that people would buy. So for instance, if the price were $5, then the quantity supplied would equal 25 lattes, and the quantity demanded would be 9 lattes. Producers would wish to produce 25 lattes at that high price, because they get more for each latte that they sell, but consumers wouldn't want to buy very many of them. So there would be a lot of unsold lattes. So say there'd be 16 unsold lattes. Well, this excess supply or surplus of lattes would give suppliers an incentive to lower their price in order to sell the unsold inventory. So maybe they would try dropping their price to $4. Well, at a price of $4, they still wouldn't be able to sell all of the lattes that they want to make. They'd have to drop their price even more, and the price is going to keep falling until the price equals the market equilibrium price. Conversely, if the price were lower than the equilibrium price, then there would be a shortage of the good. At a low price, a lot of consumers would wish to purchase the product because it's cheap, but producers wouldn't be willing to make very much of it because they couldn't get very much for selling it. So, for example, if the price of lattes were $1, there would be a shortage. So producers would only make 5 lattes at that low price, but consumers would want to buy 21 of them. In this situation, the competition between consumers would tend to ensure that the price gets bid up. So either consumers will offer a higher price, or alternatively, the producers like Starbucks will realize that there's a whole bunch of people out there who would be willing to pay a higher price for the good, and they'll try raising it. In general, if there's a shortage, prices will continue to rise until the market reaches an equilibrium. There's only one price in which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. That's the equilibrium price, and it's the only price where neither buyers or sellers have an incentive to change the price that they're offering. The price of every product in a market economy and the quantity bought and sold is determined by this interaction of suppliers and demanders, of people who wish to consume the product and people who are thinking about producing it. These tools of supply and demand can also tell us what will happen to the price of a product and what will happen to the quantity bought and sold if there's any change in the market. So, in order to determine the effects of any economic event, first you have to decide whether the event shifts the supply curve, the demand curve, or both. Second, you have to decide in which direction the curve shifts. And then third, you have to figure out what the new equilibrium price and quantity is going to be. So let's look at an example. So here we have the market for hybrid cars. So the demand curve is downward sloping, indicating that at a higher price, consumers wish to purchase less hybrid cars, and the supply curve is upward sloping, which shows that if the price, or as the price rises, producers will be willing to make more hybrid cars, and there's only one price at which the quantity that producers want to make is equal to the quantity that consumers want to buy, and that's the equilibrium price P1. So the price in a market will tend to gravitate towards P1, and the quantity of hybrid cars made and purchased will be Q1. Okay, now what do you think will happen if there's an increase in the price of gas? How will that affect the market for hybrid cars? Well, hybrid cars are very fuel efficient, so if gas prices go up, then people will tend to want to purchase more hybrid cars. So it's probably not going to shift the supply curve. It doesn't change the cost of producing a hybrid car, but it does change the quantity of people who want to buy a hybrid car at any hypothetical price. So this will probably shift the demand curve to the right. So an increase in the price of gas will increase the demand for hybrid cars. So that's step number 1 and 2. And the third thing to figure out is what's going to happen to the price and the quantity bought and sold. Well, if the demand for a product increases, then everything else equal, that'll tend to cause the price of the product to go up and the quantity bought and sold to go up as well. So if the demand increases, both the price and the quantity increase. The demand decreases, the price and the quantity decrease. Notice that as the price rises, producers are willing to supply a larger quantity of hybrid cars even though the supply curve hasn't shifted. So at this new higher price, the quantity supplied increases, and that's what allows the producers to meet this increased demand for the product. But you always want to be careful to distinguish between a shift in a curve and a moving along the curve. Right, so we just went from P1 in Q1 to P2 in Q2. That was initiated by an increase in the demand for hybrid cars, which led to an increase in price and an increase in quantity supplied. So the quantity bought and sold to begin with was equal, and the quantity bought and sold to end with is equal. So we move from an equilibrium point 1 to an equilibrium point 2. Okay, example number 2. What do you think will happen if there is a technological advance that makes it easier or cheaper to produce hybrid cars? So remember our steps. So first we have to figure out which curve it'll shift. We have to figure out which direction it'll shift the curve. And then third, we have to figure out what the new equilibrium price and quantity is going to be. So if a technological improvement reduces the cost of producing hybrid cars, that's going to increase the supply of them. So we show that by shifting the supply curve to the right. And notice that an increase in supply will cause the price to fall and the quantity bought and sold in the market to increase. So we're contrasting an increase in demand to an increase in supply. When demand increases, price and quantity go up. When supply increases, the price goes down, but the quantity goes up. Or we could look at what will happen if two things happen at once. Right, so suppose that the price of gas rises and new technology reduces the production costs of producing hybrid cars. Well, in this case, we're going to have to shift both the demand curve and the supply curve. So both curves are going to shift to the right. That much we know for sure. However, we're not sure what's going to happen to the price of the good. So an increase in supply and an increase in demand both tend to cause the quantity to increase. So we can unambiguously say that if the price of gas rises and some new technological improvement reduces the production costs of producing hybrid cars, that'll cause the quantity of hybrid cars bought and sold to increase. But what will happen to the price will depend upon whether the shift in demand is greater than or less than the shift in supply. The shift in supply. So the way I've drawn it first is by having the demand shift be greater than the supply shift. Well, in this case, that's the overall effect is going to be for the price to rise. So the increase in demand is tending to push the price up. The increase in supply is tending to push the price down. But the increase in demand is greater than the increase in supply, so on net, the price will go up a little bit. However, if the supply increases more than the demand, then the price will fall. So here I've shown an example where the technological improvement is greater than the increase in the demand caused by higher gas prices. Well, in that case, the price is going to fall a little bit. So the increase in demand is tending to push the price up, but the increase in supply is tending to push the price down. The decrease in the price caused by the change in supply is greater than the increase in price caused by the change in demand. So on net, the price is going to fall a little bit. And if the increase in demand and increase in supply were equal in magnitude, then the price would remain unchanged. So in conclusion, market prices are what help to coordinate the activities of buyers and sellers in a market setting where there's no one centrally planning anything and everyone is planning things for themselves. So in this decentralized system, the price adjusts to balance supply and demand. If the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, there will be a shortage and the price will get bid up. And if the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, then there'll be a surplus, and that'll tend to push the price down. So these equilibrium prices are the signals that guide economic decisions, and they're what allocates scarce resources in a decentralized market economy. Alright, so that's it for this lecture on the basics of supply and demand. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care.